Good morning and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife. This morning we are going to kick off with a conversation learning about the global deal for nature with Jameson Irvin, the manager for the Nature and Development Global Program, I believe at the United Nations. Welcome, Jameson.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Shall I jump right in, or what do you recommend?
If you could introduce yourself for the record, that would be helpful.
Certainly. My name is Jameson Irvin. I work for the United Nations Development Program, and I've lived and worked in Vermont for more than 30 years.
Great. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Shall I jump in?
Yes.
Super, great, fabulous. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And there we go. Great, so thanks very much for this opportunity. And to start, I'm going to give you just a few words about my background. And then I have three parts to this presentation. The first is the global context for nature, for biodiversity loss, for climate. The second is the evolving context and what we're learning globally about the linkages between nature and climate. And the third is I'd like to talk about the global deal for nature and show how that plays out in Vermont. Let's get started. So I've lived in Vermont for more than 30 years. I've served on the Duxbury Planning Commission, the Land Trust, the Waterbury Local Energy Action Partnership. That picture is actually me 30 years ago, I'm ashamed to say, looking at land conservation in my own backyard, which is Camel's Hump. I did my PhD from the University of Vermont, looking at natural resources, looking specifically at cross-boundary land use planning in and around protected areas in Vermont. And I have over 30 years of experience. I've started working 3 years in Nepal, but I've also started the Forest Stewardship Council. I was deep in the field of forestry. I worked for 12 years in nature NGOs. And for the past 13 years, I've worked for the United Nations Development Program. And in that capacity, I support 140 countries in developing their own national biodiversity plans. I support 200 countries and territories in looking at parks and protected areas. I support 60 countries in identifying the linkages between nature and climate, and 12 countries in integrated spatial planning. And I also work on a number of global events, including the Global Deal for Nature and other associated events. And I'll get into that in just a moment. So what's the broad global context that we're talking about? There were 4 major decisions that came out in 2015, and I just want to touch on them because they have a bearing on this discussion. The first is the global adoption, including by the US, of the Sustainable Development Goals. These are a set of 17 goals that have to do with poverty and hunger, well-being, etc. 2 of these have a bearing. And the first is Goal 15, which is life on land, looking at protecting and restoring nature, restoring degraded forests, avoiding extinctions, and really integrating the value of nature into land use planning. And the second is climate action. And this is strengthening the resilience and the adaptive capacity of society to natural hazards. The second big agreement I'm sure everyone's heard about is the Paris Agreement. And there are 2 elements here in Article 5 that really focus on conserving and enhancing carbon sinks, especially forests, and encouraging society to create incentives for forest conservation, protection, restoration, and management. The third major deal that happened 5 years earlier was the 2010 to 2020 Global Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. 192 countries signed on to this. And it has a couple of targets that also have a bearing, including protecting land that represents 17% of the Earth's terrestrial surface, avoiding extinctions, and protecting areas important for water, health, well-being, and protecting areas important for carbon mitigation and adaptation. You'll note that that plan ended in 2020, and in just a moment, I'll give you an update of what's happened in the last 2 years. Before we go further, though, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. When people hear protected areas, they might have very different definitions. So the generally globally accepted definition, this is photo taken about a month ago from my deck of Camel's Hump, which is a protected area, is a clearly defined space, geography, that's recognized or dedicated or managed through legal means, such as an act or bill, to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services. So that's the broad definition. But it does not mean that every protected area is a strict area. In fact, there are at least 6 different categories internationally, ranging from strictly protected to lands that have sustainable use. Here's a snapshot of the global status of protected areas. And the stats are that we're at 16.8%. Remember that our target was 17%. We came really close to meeting that target. And for marine, it's 8%, close to the 10% target. To give you a little bit of context, you can see the gradual growth of protection over the last 30 years. You can see that in 2010, shortly after the approval of this agreement, there was a sharp uptake in marine conservation. And in the last 3 years, there's been a very sharp uptake of terrestrial commitments. Because of COVID, all of the negotiations are on halt. They've been postponed for 2 years. Word has it that the next global biodiversity strategic plan for the globe will happen in June in China, hoping it's not postponed again. And the idea here is that there are at least 3 targets that have a bearing on this discussion. The first is to ensure integrated spatial land use planning, retaining intact and semi-wild and wild lands. The second is to ensure at least 30% of land and sea are conserved in effective, representative, and well-connected areas. So when you hear 30%, 30 by 30, this is where that 30% comes from. And then target 8 is to manage nature to mitigate and adapt to climate. So those are the global frameworks that have been put in place and are about to be put in place. But what's the evolving context? There are 5 pieces I want to share. The first is that there's a realization that biodiversity is the foundation for human well-being. It started with this so-called wedding cake image that the Stockholm Resilience Center put together. I put this together for the UN, which shows that nature underpins at least 6 of these big societal goals. 8 out of 10 people on this planet live on less than $10 a day, and about half of them depend on nature through farming, fisheries, and forestry for their livelihoods. Nature underpins food security, our health, our water security. It protects us from disasters, and it helps with climate mitigation and adaptation. So this is a transformation that's occurred in the last, I'd say, 5 years. Second big transformation is a recognition of planetary boundaries. This revised chart just came out this week with plastics finally being filled in here, showing that we've exceeded the boundaries that define the safe operating space for humanity. And you can see here biospheric integrity sort of off the charts, that we have exceeded the ability for the planet, for us to survive. And this has become mainstream with people like David Attenborough having a Netflix documentary on planetary boundaries. This reflection, number 3, is the global risk that biodiversity loss poses to the Earth. So for the 5th year in a row, the Global Risks Report from the World Economic Forum that's happening right now in Davos is biodiversity loss is in the top 3, along with climate action failure and extreme weather. This means that loss of biodiversity poses an existential threat to humanity. And I know this is a busy chart. I don't expect you to unpack it, but what I want to show is the top 5 threats are integral to things like extreme weather or crisis with debt or natural resources disasters or state collapse. So biodiversity loss is now recognized globally for at least 5 years as underpinning the unraveling of our society. So when I talk about this with governments that I work with around the world, we actually talk about a 5-part crisis: climate crisis, water crisis, food and soil crisis, biodiversity crisis, and also an inequality and health crisis. So a little bit about the biodiversity emergency that we face. We're really lucky in Vermont because we don't see this as much, but if you step outside into other countries, other contexts, you'll see that we really are facing a disaster. So we've lost about 68% of biodiversity since 1970. And this is not limited to particular places in the world. It's across all continents and all countries. And we're seeing increasingly the economic impacts. More than half of global GDP is at risk from biodiversity loss. I just trolling a couple of my news feed, and this came out 3 days ago. China could get a 1.9 trillion boost and 88 million jobs by investing in nature, but they could also see in the multi-trillion loss if they continue to see a loss of biodiversity. And the fifth evolving context is the role between nature and climate. On one hand, land use, this is clearing of forests, traditional agriculture as it's currently practiced, is responsible for 24% of greenhouse gases. However, it could be up to 38% of our mitigation of greenhouse gases if we protect and conserve forests, if we practice regenerative agriculture, if we stop cutting down mangroves and we start investing in them. I've seen a more nuanced understanding in the past 5 years, but especially in the last 1 to 2 years about forests and climate. First, older and mature forests sequester more carbon than younger forests. You may hear from people who have a vested interest that younger forests capture more carbon. They capture carbon faster, but overall, less carbon. So older, mature forests really are the ticket for sequestering more carbon than younger forests. Second, these large intact patches and intact forests are absolutely key. It's not just the forest, it's the interaction of the ecosystem, including soils. So any carbon accounting, we have to account for forest soils in the carbon calculus. Short story, older forests are better for carbon, and we need big patches. Global deal for nature. What is it? Who's behind it? Let me help you unpack. It's really about three things. It's about science, it's about maps and data, and these are indicative maps and data, and it's about a global movement, including more than 90 of the world's governments. So back in 2019, there was an article that really stood out, a global deal for nature, guiding principles, milestones, and targets. And that was followed up last time, 2 years ago, by similar authors calling for a global safety net. And they called for 30% of the land to be protected by 2030, and eventually for roughly half of the planet to be protected by 2050. Why 30%? Well, scientists widely agree that 30% of protection is the minimum required to prevent ecological breakdown at local, regional, and global scales. 30% would safeguard half of our terrestrial carbon stocks and prevent, or at least mitigate, climate breakdown, and would reduce extinction risk by 90%. So the map shows where land protection could have the biggest impact. And I'm happy to share with Representative Sheldon the science behind this. It's also a campaign. We see this big movement behind this 30 by 30 movement. So who's behind it? The board includes primarily former world leaders and heads of state. So for example, one of the chair is Russ Feingold, former senator, as well as the former prime minister of Ireland and many others. It is supported by more than 90 governments, and you see here at an event that we ran 2 years ago, you can see heads of state claiming their support for 30 by 30. 94 heads of state have endorsed something similar that depends on the 30 by 30 called Leaders Pledge for Nature, explicitly saying they would like to protect 30% by 2030 in each of their countries. And the High Ambition Coalition, led by Costa Rica, France, and UK, they're trying to get other governments to support this. And then finally, the G7 and G20 have all signed on. What does this look like in the US? Well, the Biden administration has signed on to the 30 by 30, and it would like to conserve 30% of land and 30% of ocean by 2030. And across the states, we've seen 450 elected officials from 44 states sign on to this, including 12 state reps from Vermont. And in California, Maine, New York, and South Carolina, they all have introduced 30 by 30 legislation. And in fact, California signed an executive order to pledge to 30%. In Vermont, we're really lucky to have a bold ambition in the Vermont Climate Action Plan, and the Vermont Conservation Design, which both reference 30 by 30 as sort of a baseline. So how are governments developing integrated spatial plans? This is part of my work. I'm really excited about it. I won't go into it as much depth as I'd like, but the idea is that we're enabling governments to access data to develop a map of priorities for protection. This is Costa Rica's map. Just yesterday, the Minister of Environment from Dominican Republic shared the map that they created with our help, and it looks at 30% of protection, just to give you some visuals. We're lucky in Vermont to have the Vermont Conservation Design, which calls for a robust network of protected areas for an ecologically functional landscape. So, what does this mean for Vermont? A couple of things. I know you'll hear from the Nature Conservancy in a little while. I don't want to steal their thunder. The good news is that we already have 26%, more than 26% of land in some kind of protection status. However, the percent that is managed for or could be managed for older mature forests is a tiny fraction, less than 3% of the state. The percent in GAP 1 and GAP 2 status is around 5%. GAP 1 and GAP 2 means it's managed specifically for biodiversity and not just for condo development, for example. Most of these GAP 1 lands are high elevation, they're not well connected, they're not represented. There are large swaths with little or no protection. So this is a view actually of what's on the global website of what's protected in Vermont. It's a tiny fraction because this is what's actually managed specifically for biodiversity. So we're doing great for agricultural easements, we're doing great for food security, we're doing really well for working forests, but in terms of really protecting biodiversity in those carbon sinks, not so much. Here's another map. This is from VNRC that just shows you the percent of land that's conserved. We can see whole parts of the state that have less than 5%. So I want to conclude with 5 questions and then be so bold as to pose 5 considerations. So the 5 questions. Are we managing for natural disasters? There have been some great reports that come out about flood recovery and long-term resilience in Vermont that state, to mitigate floods, communities could start by preserving existing undeveloped forest areas. It's really important, keeping in mind that 90% of Vermont state lands are in forested headwaters, and these areas are really important for mitigating floods. The costs, this is a report that just came out, the costs of Vermont floods could exceed $5.2 billion. So are we managing for natural disasters? Here's a little bit of a thumbnail sketch. Here's Vermont. This is my backyard in Duxbury. You've got Duxbury, Fayston, and Huntington, and Bolton. This is the current Camel's Hump Management Plan to log 4,800 acres in Vermont, in this particular region, in Duxbury, for example. All of these logging areas are close to roads, accessed by roads. And I want to share with you my experience from Irene. Yeah, so that happened on our street. We lost a bridge, we lost a major part of a road. We spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in Duxbury trying to repair just this one series of road. So this is the first question: are we managing for natural disasters? Irene was what, a once in a 500-year flood? All experts say we will see increased flooding. Second question: are we managing for forest intactness and integrity? This is the state of forest management on public lands. And when you look at integrity, yes, we do have a pretty high area of relatively high integrity for now, great, but we also don't have many areas that have very high integrity, and we have a lot of fragmentation. So here's another view of it, we have very few large forested blocks with high integrity, and those that we do have are currently slated for a pretty high degree of logging in Vermont. There's another view of fragmentation and degradation within a state park within Vermont. So I want to give you a sort of a zoom out a little bit. When we look at the urban and exurban, peri-urban development that's happening around Vermont, we can see these areas of orange really encroaching, and we can anticipate that will continue. So protecting these large blocks in unfragmented areas is really important. So an aspect here that we have to consider is that we have a very high potential for intergenerational turnover of lands. What typically happens, as I think everyone in this committee knows, is that you have a landowner who either dies or can't pay the taxes. They give it to their kids squabble, and they decide to liquidate the land. And then you have either increased forest subdivision, increased roads, etc. I took this photo yesterday. I see a new parcel, large parcel, is probably up for forest liquidation and a subdivision. If anyone tells you that there's not enough young forest in Vermont, they are not correct. There's plenty of young forest in Vermont because people use their back 40 on private lands to fund their kids' education or to pay the mortgage or to do whatever they need to do. Third question, are we managing for regional connectivity? We can look at a parcel like this and say, okay, how are we going to manage these lands? But we really have to think in a regional context. What many people may not realize, and this is in TNC's Resilient and Connected Network work, shows that Vermont is at a crossroads for north-south and east-west connectivity that no other state is as important for connectivity as Vermont to these big chunks, the Adirondacks, the northern mountains, the Berkshire wildlife linkages, the southern greens to the whites. So when we think about individual parcels, it'd be great if we had this vision of how they connected to the region as a whole. Fourth, are we managing for human health? I have to say that both my husband had Lyme disease and his sister had Powassan, a tick-borne disease that she's suffering now from long-term, short-term memory. So this is a personal issue for me, and we know that with increased forest logging, fragmentation, we will see an increase in tick. I spent the better part of 5 years toggling back and forth between New York, where their forests are pretty much tick heaven, and I see these intact Vermont forests, and I think, do we really want to increase the tick population? And then the fifth one is a big one for me. Are we managing for carbon sequestration? The global deal for nature, the science behind it calls for increasing 5% of land globally for climate stabilization. When you look at a map of the United States, an enormous amount of land with high amounts of terrestrial carbon is not protected in the Northeast. Let me give you a closer look. So in Vermont, we have a high amount of biomass and soil organic carbon, about 826 megatons. But when you overlay that on areas that are protected, we see that actually the vast majority, and you can see it right along the spine of the Greens and up the Northeast Kingdom and throughout the eastern part of the state, are not protected. The science is clear. Our own UVM's, Dr. Keaton's statement of Vermont forests could store 2.3 to 4.2 times more carbon than they currently store if they're just allowed to grow old. And we have Dr. Muma, who says the most effective thing that we can do for carbon is to allow trees that are already growing to continue to grow to reach their full ecological potential, to store carbon and develop a forest that has all these wonderful ecosystem services, including disaster mitigation, water security, etc. So are we managing for carbon sequestration? In the next 8 years, Vermont plans triple logging on public lands. This is outside of even forest service lands. Vermont state management plans do not prioritize maintaining mature intact forests for their carbon sequestration value. This is a major challenge for us. So if I may, 5 considerations for your consideration. First is I'd love to see Vermont formally adopt ambitious protection targets to create a nature-based safety net for climate, for disaster risk reduction, for biodiversity, by protecting 30% by 2030. And you saw before we're at 26.1, so it's not that huge of a leap, but really protecting 30%. Second is aligning Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation and Vermont Fish and Wildlife plans with Vermont's Conservation Design and Climate Action Plan by prioritizing large blocks of intact, mature forests. This is not happening currently. Reconsidering protected area designation. A number of protected areas in Vermont state lands are in a designation that allows for a lot of sustainable use, which is great, but we could increase that designation to ensure older forests could contribute to climate mitigation and disaster risk reduction. So currently, as I mentioned, we have less than 3% of lands in Vermont that are designated to grow older. mature forests, not the 40, 50-year rotation, but actually the 100, 200-year rotation. And the Vermont Conservation Design calls for 8%. So we have a big area that we could increase. Fourth is to create incentives for private landowners to manage for older mature forests in large blocks. This includes temporary measures such as use valuation appraisal that helps the landowner make decisions that benefit the state for a longer term, but also easements in a wildland category for those who want to do so. And then finally, we have this wonderful Vermont Conservation Design that shows us a vision. Love to see the state engaged in an integrated spatial planning exercise that prioritizes carbon sequestration, disaster risk mitigation, forest connectivity at state and regional levels, and really puts an emphasis on larger, older, intact forests. With that, I hand it back over to you and would love to hear any questions if they exist. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing a lot of information with us. I hope that you have sent your presentation to our committee assistant so that we can revisit it.
I will do that directly, absolutely.
Thank you. That would be very helpful to us. I know I have at least one member with a question. Representative Dolan.
Good morning, Ms. Irvin, and it's an honor for me to be your representative, and I look forward to the opportunity to see you. My question early on, when you had, I think under your 5 questions, you had mentioned forest integrity. Can you describe what you mean by that term?
Yes, so there are different ways to measure it. It's different in a temperate forest, tropical forest, and I believe Eric Sorensen, who's also on the line, is the expert, Vermont's expert in it. But in short, it means a forest that has all of its parts, that it's functioning, that it is maintaining the ecological processes of early succession to late succession, that it's maintaining the hydrological cycles, basically that it has all its parts and it's functioning as a forest should in this part of the world. I know that's a gross simplification of it. Eric, I'm hoping you'll give a much more nuanced piece. There are a number of data sets out there at global and national levels that take these metrics and are able to use satellite imagery to measure forest integrity. And so some of those screenshots that I showed are aggregations of those data layers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could help us understand how water fits into the goals that have been identified. I'm curious about the sea, but since we're in Vermont, I'm also curious about freshwater resources and how they would be conserved, especially considering so much of their integrity relies on the adjacent land. So can you help us understand how the water fits into this?
Yeah, water is a huge role, and there are a couple of dimensions to it. So, in the big picture, in the global picture, roughly a third of the world's largest cities depend directly on protected forest areas for their water. So cities like Bogota in Colombia, for example, we're supporting actually Colombia to develop a protection plan that would be increased 30% across their entire eastern region to support 15 million people for water security. Vermont has a slightly different issues. We don't really have a problem with water security for the most part because we get a lot of rain, a lot of snow, and it's not really an issue. It's more about flooding. Flooding, I think, is the major issue for Vermont. And we saw firsthand with Irene what happens when you don't have natural infrastructure to help mitigate these floods. And that by natural infrastructure, I do mean intact, mature forests and functioning wetlands that can help mitigate the floods that we will see in the next decades.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative McCullough.
So I've got 2 questions. I'm going to go right now to just build on the chair's question with a somewhat maybe different ask. You mentioned conserving oceans. How do we conserve oceans, or are you really talking about better ocean management practices?
Yeah, Vermont as a landlocked state really has nothing to do with oceans. So this is I shared with you the global picture. And
yes,
so
totally.
Sorry?
Yes, totally. And you did mention globally, and part of it was conserving oceans, as I understand.
That's right. So the world's nations have agreed, including the US, to protect 30% of their ocean territory, looking at the EEZ areas, the land next to a country within 200 miles. So for ocean countries, that's part of their protection goals. For countries that don't have a marine component, it's just simply not a component. So there are two components: terrestrial protection and marine protection. And Vermont is, obviously just the terrestrial component.
Okay, I get that now. Good, thank you. The
Yes,
other
certainly.
is your question, much of your presentation is built on carbon sequestration, and rightly so, forest protections for everything we know that they do for us on the planet. You mentioned in passing regenerative agriculture, and I have learned from learned sources that if we could change conventional agricultural practices on just 5% on the planet, we could stabilize our situation, and largely through carbon sequestration and largely through the water cycle, which you didn't really mention. But so could you comment on that, please?
I could, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. It's also a pet topic, but I couldn't fit in everything into the 25 minutes or so. Regenerative agriculture is a major global movement, not just among sort of a fringe, you might think fringe hippies back to the land. It's not that at all. Kellogg's and Danone and some major agricultural and food companies are now fully committed to it. Regenerative agriculture, which is nothing more than what smart farmers have been doing all along: cover crop rotation, ensuring compost on their lands. That does help with water retention, soil fertility, it reduces erosion. And I don't know about the 5% that would mitigate carbon sequestration. I do know it's a huge amount. Scientists really vary in their estimates, but changing business as usual agriculture is a global food imperative, because the way that we're currently farming for food with high chemical inputs leads to soil degradation, which leads to a negative cycle. I do know that scientists estimate we have about 55 years left globally of soil productivity, and that's it, if at current rates of soil loss, soil fertility loss, etc. So you're absolutely right. Regenerative agriculture is an enormous solution for carbon, but also for human nutrition and well-being.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Dolan.
I wanted to follow up on the chair's question with respect to water. Oftentimes when we think about disaster preparation or hazard mitigation, we think along the lines of how to protect or restore our floodplains. And yet here you're talking about some of the co-benefits of landscape-based initiatives where most of the water in a storm event, in a severe storm event, are actually held in our forest lands, and you refer to Bogota. Can you speak a little bit more about the role of forests in providing resilience to severe weather events?
I'm not a hydrological expert, I'll put that up front, but what I have seen around the world and in the science that I have read, well, first of all, let me start with 90% of state lands are in forested headwaters. So the steward of where floods originate from the top, and they start to trickle down, they start to become a deluge, is that the forested headwaters are the place where this early intervention should start. The floodplains are when the flood happens, and we need to have floods that can be able to absorb that. But forested headwaters absorb the water. When you start to create forest fragmentation, invasive species, you start logging, you change the seral stage diversity, you then reduce the ability of those forests to slow down the flood, and you reduce their ability to absorb the water that will then flow off. So when you look at a logging operation of 10, 20, 50 acres, whatever it is, you're going to see more runoff. And that runoff goes into streams, goes into rivers, and eventually you get, the the floods that we saw in Irene. Again, I'm not a hydrological expert. I really encourage you to speak with one who could speak with more authority than I could.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I recall hearing stories from old timers describing the floods in Vermont in the 1930s, when
Yes.
much of our landscape was still cleared. And they said the Winooski, for example, was just a moving landslide, a mudslide, because of the amount of soil loss, not and the water not being able to be stored in the upper uplands.
It's exactly right. Those little tiny rootlets, they're doing their job. They're holding the infrastructure required to slow the water down, absorb it, and then dispense it more slowly. When you have these big areas, even when you do uneven age management, you're still creating pathways for flooding.
Thank you.
Representative Morris?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was similar to Ms. Dolan's, Representative Dolan's question just now, but I was going to use a specific example, if I may. And Ms. Irvin, thank you for coming in today, and your presentation is wonderful. But we talked about Irene a couple of times and the flooding we had around the state, and I wanted to use Killington Mountain and Route 4 into Rutland as an example, and see how you would tie in your forest, old forest growth into how that would mitigate some of the flooding they experienced there. Because we do have the national forest at the top of Killington. And I was just wondering for clarification, and I think you touched base on that a little bit, as to how logically that can be explained to prevent or reduce the amount of flooding that we had, that we saw during Tropical Storm Irene on Route 4 in a specific area. And it happened elsewhere around the state. I recognize that. But on that specific one, I was hoping you could touch base on how old forest growth or protected forest areas would help mitigate that. And I think you just answered most of that already.
Yeah, I wish I could give a better description, and I'm not familiar exactly with what happened in Route 4. I'm really more familiar with what happened in Waterbury, in Duxbury, in Bolton, etc. But what I'll say is a couple things. The floods are a confluence of events and factors that add up to more than the sum of the parts. So when you look at Irene, it was a factor of, I don't know exactly the forest issues that occurred in that area, but it's a factor of the forest cover and headwaters and the ability to absorb that at its source, factor of how streams are managed and whether they're dredged or whatever is happening with those. It's a factor of the road system and the culvert system. It's a factor of dams and their capacities, a whole bunch of different interacting factors, and the floodplain and how much you've managed and straightened the water course. So I don't know the system, but I will say that one of the factors is intact older forests will prevent more flooding. That's unequivocal. And I want to take this opportunity to say, it requires a mind shift that currently needs to happen, I believe, which is to view nature, change the view of nature as a piñata in which we can keep getting the goodies out. And it's multi-use and multifunction, to viewing nature as a safety net for preventing against the next floods, for catastrophic biodiversity loss, for ensuring that we have a system in place that prevents societal breakdown or ecological breakdown. And that shows up in management plans for state forests. It shows up in how we manage parks, etc. I think there needs to be a paradigm shift, really think differently.
Thank you for that. And I apologize if there was any duplication there.
Not at all, no.
Other questions from members? Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Irvin. That was incredibly helpful and helps put us in a little bit of perspective here in Vermont. So thank you very much.
Pleasure's mine, and I'm at your service if you need anything. And I'll be sure to send Ms. Carroll the PDF as well as the citations behind it. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you again.
Yep, bye.
All right, members, it is 9:40. Let's see. We have up next Gus Goodwin, Senior Conservation Planner at the Nature Conservancy. We will welcome Mr. Goodwin with us.
Hi, good morning all. Pleasure to be here.
Good morning. Are you ready to go?
Yes, sorry. I'm happy to start sharing and going if that's where we are. Okay. Bring up my slides. All right, my name is Gus Goodwin. I'm the Senior Conservation Planner at the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. And I'm very excited to be here today to share with you the Nature Conservancy's work on mapping resilient and connected landscapes across the country and taking a close look at how that touches down into Vermont. Before diving in, I'd take a minute just to introduce the Nature Conservancy. We've been working for over 60 years to protect land and water in Vermont. We're probably best known for our network of 58 natural areas, which covers about 30,000 acres and sustains some of our state's most ecologically important lands. But that's really just part of our work. And in that same 60 years, we've also helped our partners protect about 300,000 acres of land that provides timber, recreation, wildlife habitat, clean water, and countless other values to the people of Vermont. We've developed science that guides conservation in our state, and we work collaboratively with our partners to implement a whole wide range of conservation actions. And we aspire to be, working towards helping Vermont be a place where both people and nature can thrive. We have programs in all 50 states and 72 other countries, but we still bring a tight focus on local issues that's paired with a broad perspective that's informed by our large network of scientists, land managers, and our policy team. And the science that I've been asked to share with you today is a really great example of this, which draws on the expertise of over 100 scientists across the country and a decade of work by a core team at the Nature Conservancy led by Mark Anderson, who's our Director of Conservation Science, and I believe who joined this committee last year to share some of this work. And I'm glad to bring this work back to the group in the context of efforts to improve the protection of lands and waters within the 30 by 30 framework. And this is exactly where the type of science we'll be looking at today can be most helpful in directing conservation actions to areas that provide the greatest return on investment and giving our natural systems and human systems the greatest margin of success in a rapidly changing climate. The Nature Conservancy is supportive of federal and state level efforts to implement a 30 by 30 conservation vision for both land and water. And I recognize that the current bill under consideration has a strong terrestrial focus, so I'll target my presentation today on terrestrial systems. But TNC would welcome the opportunity to join this group again to share our understanding of how this vision could translate into freshwater systems. We've been working with a wide group of partners to try and think about how you would define conservation in an aquatic system or freshwater system, which is a totally different beast than thinking about it in a terrestrial framework. But nonetheless, it's a critical component of our work. So let's just kind of follow Ms. Irvin's presentation with some of the kind of backdrop of this work. And just starting with the incredibly obvious to this group, especially this year with the release of the newest Vermont climate assessment, is that climate change is happening. And we can see that more clearly than ever. We've seen changes in annual temperature, precipitation, and extreme weather events. They're widely at play in our region. And we know that nature is starting to respond. So species are moving northward and upslope, tracking a warming climate and favorable habitat. And it's not just the fast-moving animals that are moving. A recent study found that about 86 different species of trees, trees, right, long-lived sedentary organisms, have shifted their range northward and westward as a result of climate change. And this change itself is not a bad thing. It's a very good thing. Nature is a dynamic force and it can be resilient to change. And we know this from pollen records that help us understand about how trees moved at the end of the last ice age. And so this chart shows the response of 4 types of trees following the retreat of continental ice, which is shown in gray at the end of the last ice age about 12,000 years ago. And so broadly speaking, there were very few extinctions during this time because species were able to move and adapt to the changing climate. And you can see that some trees, like the oak in yellow, greatly expanded their range, while others simply just marched northwards. And what's really interesting is that these groups of species didn't simply march up together. They moved independently, each following suitable climate envelopes and habitat conditions. And a nice example of this is looking at the beech and the hemlock, which are in blue and orange. 12,000 years ago, they didn't occupy the same space, but now they have a very similar range. But of course, we live in a very different world now. The rate of climate change is unprecedented and unpredictable, and the landscape is degraded and fragmented by development and other land use changes that make it very hard for species to move. And those things are hard for wildlife, even without the extra stress of climate change. And all this adaptation that we're asking species to do to redistribute in the face of a climate transformation is also taking place in the context of a biodiversity crisis. A recent UN report concluded that nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history due to land use change, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. And there's an abundance crisis, not just an extinction crisis. We're losing some of our most common species. They're just not as common. And this was really underscored by an Audubon report that found that North America has lost more than 1 in 4 birds in the last 50 years, including lots of common species. But there's one sign of light in this analysis, and I direct you to take a look at the chart in kind of center right, showing the change in abundance of different groups of birds. And you can see that nearly all groups are declining except for wetland birds, which is really a testament to the kind of tight focus and multi-pronged approach towards protecting wetlands habitats, improving wetland regulations, and creating programs that promote thriving populations of wetland species, or wetland birds. And I think that that's a really nice note to transition into the Resilient and Connected Network, which is the Nature Conservancy science product I'm sharing today, because the Resilient and Connected Network is kind of a nice roadmap that can help us direct similar efforts that were brought to bear on the wetlands towards other parts of the landscape to ensure that all species have a chance to thrive and adapt in a changing climate. So this is the Resilient and Connected Network, which I'll be calling the RCN. And it's motivated really by the question of where are the places that are best suited to sustain biodiversity and ecological function in a changing climate. And there are 3 primary components to this analysis: resilience, connectedness, and biodiversity. And this tracks closely with what Ms. Urban presented earlier. Ecological resilience is broadly defined as the ability to rebound from a disturbance. And from a climate perspective, we take this to mean places that will sustain future biodiversity and ecosystem function in our changing climate. And specifically what we mean are places that have lots of microclimates that are connected at a fine scale and represent all the physical components of our landscape. And I'll describe in detail what this means and why it's important. So resilience begins with geology, and the combined influences of bedrock geology, soil type, elevation, landform aspect, all of these are responsible for driving today's biodiversity. And intuitively, this makes sense, and we know this. We know that the thick, nutrient-rich soils of a limestone valley will support different species than the thin, acidic soils on a granite hilltop. We know our chilly mountaintops support different species than a warm lakeshore. And while those species at each of those sites may change as the climate warms, we can be confident that these enduring features will continue to support a wide variety of different species. And at the Nature Conservancy, we call this approach conserving the stage, which is kind of a nice metaphor where if all the species at a given site are actors in a play, the actors and even the play itself will change over time. But as long as we protect the underlying stage, we continue to have plays and actors in the future, even if they are different. So the Nature Conservancy mapped all these stages, so that's every geophysical setting and every ecoregion, which are shown in red on this map, to make sure that all of those different stages are represented in our final conservation design. But species need to be able to move to respond to climate change. So in the short term, this is likely going to take place as short-term movements within a site between favorable microclimates. And these microclimates are things we can picture. We've got cool, dark ravines, cold north-facing slopes that hold snow late into the spring, and warm southern slopes that are the first to flower. And this is all really driven by topography. And what I've got here is a side profile of one of our natural areas in the northern Green to help illustrate how this topographic complexity can promote climate complexity as well. So we have elevation, latitude, cold air drainage, and aspect, all of these things will create a really rich tapestry of microclimates on a given landscape. And then to translate that from 2D to 3D, which is, you can see actually that's a model of Mount Mansfield showing all the different microclimates and landforms. So you can end up with a site that has lots of climate options for species. It has lots of different cool places, warm places, and when they're connected at a fine scale, it gives species climate options and the ability to move between them. So this is a map of the kind of the data product. So remember, we were talking about landscape diversity, which is microclimates. So that's climate options. Places with lots of options are shown in green, and places with fewer options are shown in brown. And then we also think about connectedness. So can the species move between those climate options? So high connected lands shown in green, lower connectivity in brown. And packaged together, that's what we define as climate resilience. So places with lots of climate options and allow species to move. So resilient sites shown in green and less resilient sites shown in brown. And you can see that Vermont has quite an abundance of highly resilient land, which is really exciting and a very positive thing for us. And this is a function of our very rich geologic history, our topographic complexity, and then a century of reforestation and thoughtful land use planning and conservation that has retained natural cover and the local connectivity across our state. So lots of short-term options for movement and adaptation in our state. But for those short-term movements to add up to long-term survival, we need to be thinking about how, at a continental scale, these lands are connected together. And this is a wonderful graphic that illustrates some of the connectivity analyses that lie under the hood of our analysis here. And while it's fairly simplified, I think it's also really instructive. And you can just see the scale of movement that may be at hand. And I draw your attention to two areas showing different types of movement. On the right, you can see lots of concentrated flow, lots of species movement through a very defined area, mostly tracking the Appalachian Mountains, running up into Vermont. But there'll also be places like shown in the center of the United States that will support a very kind of diffuse flow, not tracking specific linear features, but moving upwards and northwards in a diffuse area. And so we integrated that site resilience and the climate flow. So think about all those moving crawlers. We've identified the areas that support lots of that movement, shown in blue under the climate flow map. And while I'm giving it short shrift in this presentation, it should go without saying that biodiversity is one of the fundamental prerequisites for this whole analysis. And we've mapped, with the help of our partners at Vermont Fish and Wildlife in Vermont, and then the similar programs in all other states, areas that are really important for biodiversity. So, we need these really important species, natural communities to be robust and thriving so that they can send out dispersers to move and adapt to a changing climate. So it's an essential piece of the strategy for resilient and connected network. And altogether, those three ingredients, the site resilience, the climate flow, and existing biodiversity, are mapped together for the RCN. And you can see at a continental scale, you can even make out Vermont there, showing lots of land within the network. And it should, go without saying, and Ms. Irvin introduced many of these concepts, but I'll just reiterate them, that these lands that are highly resilient for climate change and support biodiversity, while a smaller portion of the landscape, yield outsized benefits. So on the East Coast, the RCN is roughly 23% of the network, but it stores 56% of all the above ground carbon and 75% of the high value source water. Provides oxygen for nearly 2 billion people, mitigates pollution, and generates billions of dollars in recreation. And while some of these analyses are hard to translate down to the state of Vermont, we do know, we are able to calculate the carbon yield for these lands in Vermont. And there was a recent report by the Trust for Public Land that was able to document that the recreation economy for Vermont's conserved landscape is, in the billions, and that for every dollar invested in conservation, the state yields $9 of economic return. And we can be sure that many of those values are produced by lands within the RCN. And so remembering that the primary question behind the RCN is, where are the places that are most likely to maintain biodiversity in a changing climate? Across that country, it generally identifies lands about in the top 25%. But Vermont, 53% of Vermont is in the RCN, which is disproportionately high. So that means there's an element of responsibility for Vermont to do our part for our neighbors, but also an opportunity for us to grab an outsized slice of that benefit pie that I was just sharing earlier. And I would like to just pause here for a moment and dwell on the kind of important role that Vermont plays in our region. And I think these maps are really instructive and help inform many of the points, again, introduced by Ms. Irvin in her presentation. Vermont's role is kind of a connectivity crossroads, and that's important both for our existing biodiversity. Wide-ranging mammals need a wide, extensive swath of connected habitat to fulfill their life cycle and have adequate genetic exchange to maintain viable populations. But it's even more critical in a changing climate where nearly all species will have to move or adapt to a changing climate. And you can see from that animation before, the map here on the upper left, that Vermont really is part of this larger conduit for species moving in response to climate change along the Appalachians. And the third role from a biodiversity standpoint is that we have a high degree of biodiversity in our state remaining due to reforestation and thoughtful land use, but also tied to our kind of inherent geologic diversity. I've heard rumors that Vermont has 1,000 more species than our neighbors in New Hampshire, in part because of our fertile calcium-derived soils. So species that are rare in Vermont can be even more rare in our neighboring states like New Hampshire, and even some of our common species, which we don't consider rare at all, are very difficult to find in our neighboring states. So Vermont has an element of responsibility and opportunity to sustain these really critical source populations of biodiversity that are necessary for the redistribution in the changing climate. And while I said that Vermont has 53% within Resilient and Connected Network, our efforts to protect that do not quite track. So by our estimation, roughly 28% of the RCN in Vermont is protected by measures that would ensure that have a clear biodiversity focus and mandate. Across the state, that percentage is in the low 20s. So there's considerable room and work ahead of us in meeting a 30 by 30 vision. And while I should say a big question that remains for the group is what counts as in and out. And I urge the committee to consider the input of our conservation partners in helping that determine that threshold. But I think it's safe to say that there's considerable work ahead for us. And I will also just use a minute to address a potential question, which is just the interplay between Vermont conservation design and the Resilient and Connected Network, which, VCD was introduced by Ms. Irvin in her presentation, and I believe will be raised by Eric Sorensen in his subsequent presentation. And I would just say that there's a high degree of agreement between the two data sets. And you can think of that as a second opinion and also a label of identifying these different functions. So I think there's a fairly robust scientific consensus about which lands are really important for Vermont's biodiversity, ecological function, and climate resilience. And with that, I will end and take questions.
Thank you very much. Do members have questions? Representative McCullough.
Thank you. I want to make certain, of course, it's all about the dollar for many. $9 return for every dollar. And what I So is that in the process, $9 return for every dollar spent on protecting environmental resilience, biodiversity, and ecological functions? Or did you have a shorter definition of what we're protecting for the getting the $9 return on?
Oh, the $9 return includes benefits like water quality, carbon storage, job creation,
Yep.
and the wider community benefits.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
And further, that I think that number, who did the study of that? Was it?
It's the TPL was the Trust for Public Land was the author, but it was supported by a broad network of conservation partners that included the Nature Conservancy.
Great, thank you.
And it's available on the website.
Other members have questions? Right, I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Committee, we will take a, let's live it up and have a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:10.